All right, everyone. Wow, that's louder than expected. Good morning. I hope you're doing good for this first day of the Paris Space Week. Sorry to wake you up with law, but don't worry, you're not going to go back to sleep. That's going to stimulate you, I promise. So, every year, for a few years now, I'm doing a presentation about legal stuff on the Paris Space Week. And for this edition, I wanted to go on a quite specific topic related to space activities, and that really shows how Newspace has changed the way space is conducting business with a new field of innovation and venture, which is the orbit. Before diving into it, I just wanted to make a quick poll. You can just raise your hand, no problem, but to know about the participant, if you are in the industry, if you are in specific field. So first thing first, it looks like a basic question, but who works in space? Okay, no surprise here. Who works for space services? Okay. And last but not least, who works for in-orbit services? Interesting to see. So, why should we talk today about in-orbit services, and why is it interesting for lawyers? You can tell that. Historically, the space industry was more built about what we say to be the legacy. We have big companies working with the government, with a lot of national institutions, providing a long-term vision of space, especially if going from the land, from Earth, to an orbit, a specific orbit to deliver a service. It can be satellite communication, it can be Earth observation, it can be transportation for human experiment. But long story short, the idea was to go from one point on the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, to an orbit, and if it was a manned flight, go back. But if it was just robotic experimentation, leave it there until the end of life, and eventually decommissioning if it was possible to do so. So it was more like a vertical approach. There was nothing really horizontal on it. But with Newspace and a broader evolution of technology, we see now technology first, and now companies and ventures willing to adventure in a new field, which is more horizontal, which is servicing basically horizontally, satellite to satellite, constellation to constellation, and more. What is interesting to do a parallel with the traditional silos of the space industry. Traditionally, you have launchers, satellite communication, Earth observation, exploration, data, resources, and travel. This is the traditional silos of the space industry. But if you analyze in orbit, the thing you can say is that in orbit services can be applied to any of the existing and traditional fields. For instance, if you take launchers, one big question we are asking as a lawyer, especially when you are dealing with contract, is that when we have let's say a CubeSat that is on an in-orbit device, which is already a payload of a satellite, what is happening legally speaking? Because there was already a launch on the surface of the Earth, but if you are, if your payload is imprisoned within another payload that serves as a launcher, is it a second launcher? How does that work regarding to the regulatory body? Every of this question is right now really on the very beginning of the reflection on this. But that's interesting to notice that every kind of field we have, it can be Earth observation, it can be satellite communication. For instance, we have now companies putting some telecommunication devices on satellite, not in order to communicate with the Earth, but in order to communicate with other satellite and constellation. This is kind of a paradigm shift on this, and that shows how in-orbit services is now the new trend of what we call new space, and even now next space. Okay, so this figure just summarizes basically the idea. As we said, it was always a vertical scheme, and the same for contract. You have a launch, then you have a mission. The mission is performed, and at the end of the day, there is the end of life. You decommission the satellite, et voila. Now you have a launch on the surface of the Earth, but you also have potentially another launch that can happen in orbit. You can have a mission that is basically just to launch from the Earth, but you can also have a mission that is basically to launch in orbit and then to perform the services or in-orbit services that can be refueling a satellite, repairing a satellite, or performing debris removal, for instance. So you have an entire ecosystem that is now building up. And as we will see, regulatory, from a standpoint of regulation, it's quite new. And if you are an actor in this field, it's quite a gray area. So you can expand, you can experiment, but you also are in a gray zone regarding the legal standpoint, because you don't have like the traditional launching regulation that can be applied in any major jurisdiction on Earth. So, yeah, just long story short, to summarize what I just said, as traditionally we just had the Earth, we went to the orbit, and now we are doing business all around the Earth and sometimes ignoring Earth. One interesting figures I drafted a few years ago for an analysis. It was the basically trying to analyze the risk of each segment of the space industry. And if you look closely as this picture, you can see that the in-orbit services have two very high points of uncertainty. Everything related to regulation is super uncertain, and everything related to export. Why export? Because basically what we are doing, we are evolving in a non-country world. If you are in orbit, it's an international area per se. It's even without any basically physical borders. So you are basically acting in a world where you don't have this national constraints. That asks a question about just the licensing. How can you do it legally regarding your own country? And how can you perform also this operation when you are, for instance, selling in orbit something from country A to country B? Is it an export? Is it a transfer? Legally speaking, you have a lot of questions that has to be asked. So just one quick question I wanted to ask you guys in order to stimulate the conversation. I know maybe most of you are not lawyers, but if we are talking about in-orbit services, what are for you the main point that you would consider? The thing that would pop into your head and say, okay, I have this in-orbit service that I would like to deliver. Maybe I should be careful about this in the contract, or maybe I should be careful about this in the legal field. So I guess we have a mic, and if we could just circulate the mic for a few minutes, thank you so much, and feel free to intervene. The idea is to be a bit communicative on this. Thank you so much. So any reaction on this? If we're talking about in-orbit services, I know you guys are working in the field, so would you have any suggestion, idea? Sir?
Maybe navigation and having access to roads in a country.
You mean navigation on the orbit? Okay, sure. Any other inspiration, ideas? Don't be shy. I know it's the first day. It's 10 a.m. Far from Paris. Okay, no other idea. No problem. You see, that's why this topic is important. Because everybody talks about it, we don't really know what we are doing legally speaking, so that's good. But thank you, sir, for this intervention regarding how to access, how to behave in orbit. As you mentioned, of course, there is no law regarding the traffic management, and you see that is kind of a keyword. We talked about space traffic management. That's something that is very that you heard a lot right now, especially with mega constellation. How can you behave when you have a huge constellation going in front of you and you are just one satellite? You don't have any rules because you don't have any sovereignty of states. And that's what we see in 1 second. I will not bother you with all these legalese details. The idea for you is just to understand that in the international space that is an orbit, you have basically the international law, the big treaties. I'm sure everybody heard it about the 1960s treaties from the United Nations that really lays major principles such as freedom of access, responsibility of states, everything that is right now in our national laws and that circulates within in our industries. You also heard indeed about ITU. That's something quite interesting because ITU is dealing with spectrum management generally from Earth to the orbit, but now we have spectrum issues regarding orbit to orbit. So that's something that we need to take care about. And ITU, with all these conferences, is also actively thinking about how to regulate it. And you have national laws, indeed, which are, especially if you take the state of France, there is a reform going on. But if you take EU, there is also a new European space law that is on the work. And the idea of in-orbit services and constellation on the larger scale is, of course, on topic. Again, as you mentioned, sir, earlier, the question of space traffic management is super important. Why? Because when you're in orbit, of course, there is no clear rules. You don't really know where you are, but you need to behave because you have a lot of objects, sometimes dealing by themselves. Sometimes they are powered with AI. So they are automatically thinking about how they could behave. So that's why you need to have a clear consensus of how to behave. The problem is you don't have any jurisdiction because when you are in orbit, you are in the international world per se. There is no sovereignty. There is no land. So you have the country. If you are an operator, for instance, let's say you are launching from France, from Kourou, you're going to be a French operator. But what's going to happen if you are delivering in-orbit services, if you are like, let's say, for instance, launching CubeSat with your own device, but if your clients are from extra-European country, are from the US, are from China, India, what's going to happen? What's going to be the law that's going to prevent? And that's how we see the question of commercialization. Commercialization means one thing in legal term, that is contract. Because when you are dealing with space services on the larger scale, broadly speaking, every time I've got a client going up at me and say, okay, I want to deliver a new service, what parameters should I take care in order to be compliant legally speaking? You have two big factors, regulation and contract. Regulation is everything belonging to national space law, your space agency regulation, everything that applies to you from the government, basically, to your company. And then you have the second leverage, which is contract. Contract is the relation you're going to have with your partners. And thanks to the contract, that's the way you are able to define what you are basically providing as a service, what is the limitation of your service, especially regarding your liability, and in fine, if there is a problem, how can you cope with the problem? You're going to go to arbitration? Do you going to go to national court? I guess you can see right now that if you are dealing with in-orbit services, the question of where we're going to go for court, it's quite complicated to have a clear reply on this. So I wanted to have something quite concrete and quite from the field for you today. A few years ago, I was working with the European Space Agency on a paper regarding active debris removal. Active debris removal is one of the kind of a cliche mission that we see for space, for in-orbit services. Why? Because, as you know, orbits are kind of sometimes crowded with debris, and this is quite clear that in order to continue the commercialization of outer space, we need to avoid any hazard because of this object flying at very high speed around Earth. So one of the solutions is indeed to have mitigation guidelines. That's something that can be done ex ante, basically, during the process. But now, because of the development of in-orbit services, because of the development of new space, companies from all over the world are coming with disruptive solutions in order to capture the debris and maybe bring it back to Earth or maybe putting on the symmetry orbits. So basically, you have really the icon of in-orbit services. The device is lift off from the Earth and then as an independent life in orbit to capture another object and maybe never return to Earth. So that's where the in-orbit operation starts and ends. And that's, of course, you can imagine that involve a lot of legal question on this. Of course, this doesn't go from anywhere. This is something that belongs to international law for this active debris removal. It comes from the idea of space responsibility, for instance. It comes from the idea of space object registration, because, like, for instance, every time you are launching an object, a satellite, you need to register it. So when this object has reached its end of life, you need to determine what you want to do with that. Traditionally speaking, the idea was to leave it at the debris, and God knows what's going to happen. But now the idea is, by design, before you're launching the satellites, you have to comply with some regulations. For instance, in France, we call this réglementation technique, and you have to talk about passivation, about deorbitation, etc., etc. And the idea of cooperation. You will see why this idea is quite interesting. So, first question we have, legally speaking, when talking about active debris removal, what are we doing? First thing first, the debris, which used to be a satellite, for instance, belongs to somebody. It's not because it's a debris and that it cannot be controlled that it's no longer owned by somebody. So first problem that you can have is that, are you stealing the stuff, or do you have a mandate from the owner to remove it? That's why when you are an in-orbit services company, you have to really define what you are doing. And in case of ADR, that's critical, because you don't want to be capturing a satellite that is not supposed to be removed from where it is. Second problem is export. If you are, let's say, a German company providing ADR, if you have a French client, what are you doing? If the client is from Brazil, for instance, what are you doing? Even if you are in orbit, are you proceeding to an export? Because the receiver of the payload not going to be the same as the original owner, especially in the case if the contract schedule a transfer of ownership. So that's something you also have to think about. Also regarding the service, are you actually purchasing the satellite or are you just servicing it? That's going to depend on the definition you're going to have for the services per se. So long story short, when you are providing, like in this example, ADR, are you appropriating the satellite or are you just servicing it? That's a huge implication from a legal standpoint and especially also for your business. Of course, you have a lawyer on stage, so we're talking about liability. Defining the business is good, but the best thing is to know where are you going and until when are you liable for what are you actually performing. Of course, in-orbit services, I said IDR, but in-orbit services are super risky because launching the stuff is already quite tricky, but performing operation on an object, especially if the object is a debris, that means uncontrollable, that's especially dangerous because you don't want your in-orbit services module to become a debris itself. So that's why you need to, especially when you are drafting the contract relating to these in-orbit services, be very clear about what you are providing and until when you are exposed from a liability standpoint. That's when we are drafting special clauses, especially for in-orbit services. Also, because we don't benefit from the international regime that is applicable on Earth. Because we are performing nothing on Earth. We are basically in the outer space. And if you take international space law, the rule is very clear. You are liable as a state if you make a fault, if you make something like a very strong mistake. First thing first, complicated to prove it. And second, that's the international space law also only talk about governments. So if you are a company, you are below the umbrella of your government. So that puts an extra layer of complexity that you have to deal with the contract. Also, of course, quite important for in-orbit services, especially when you're talking about debris, who's going to pay for this? Because that's a very costly operation. And again, that shows how gray the area is right now for in-orbit services. You don't have any sovereignty. There is no government that's going to say, okay, this orbit is under my jurisdiction. So if you have any requirement, any permits, you have to ask me. No, that's not going to work this way. You are on your own on this. So you cannot have any tax money on this because there is no taxation possible. There is no sovereign. So if there is a tax, that could be on the ground because you are launching it. But that's something that needs to be really taken care of. So long story short, if you are dealing with in-orbit services contract, especially if it's like the example we took ADR, you need to have a bottom-up approach. You cannot, think about, okay, the treaty is going to talk about this and we're going to be covered by the treaties. You cannot also think about the regulation because even at a national level, and even if in a short period of time, we're going to have some regulation aiming to at least partially regulate in-orbit services, you're still going to have to rely on the practicality of your operation. That's why drafting a contract that is clearly adapted to what you are doing is super, super critical. And also, especially for insurance services. If you try to purchase insurance, you cannot go to the broker or to the insurer with a typical like LSA, for instance, a launch service agreement, not going to work because it can be adapted in some part, but that's not going to cover the specificities of the in-orbit services that you are providing. All right, if you just have some sort of checklist that could be interesting for you to consider if you are thinking about drafting this type of contract, what we are doing basically, of course, we are taking the idea of contract for service. That's how we are inspiring ourselves from the LSA, but that's going to end here. You are providing a service, you're not selling something. And then, of course, you have to define what you are doing, especially in fields that are not really well known in the industry, like in-orbit services. You have to define any concept that you are delivering, even if its concept is only for you, especially if it's only for you. If it's proprietary, define it in the contract. Every time with my clients when they are starting this type of services, we take a lot of time defining in the contract all the terms that they are using in their commercial proposal. So everybody's on the same page on it. And then, of course, you have the more traditional provisions that are adapted to what you are doing. Liability, we talk about it, payment and price. Scheduling is also quite tricky because if you are acting in orbit, the time is a little bit more complicated because you have to maneuver satellites that can be exposed to external conditions. So that's something you need to also take care in the contract. Indeed, force majeure is no picture on here. It's super important. And two things that are very tricky in in-orbit services is termination. When does a service terminate? If you are refueling the contract, that's easy. If you are performing an active debris removal, that's a bit more complicated. And indeed, the last one, but not least, the forum. As I mentioned, there is no sovereignty in there, so you have to handle an international context. So how do you gonna solve the disputes? That's why you need to have in my opinion, a careful escalation process, especially in orbit services. It needs to be solved on the maximum of the time between technician and engineers. It needs to be a technical solution. If there is a problem of a catastrophe, that's where you go to arbitration. But again, you're going to have a lot of discussion to find the right place, to find the right arbitrators, and to find also the right law, because you're going to have a lot of forum that could host you. And that's why it's important when you are drafting the contract to find the correct national law to apply. All right, just a few words about what I do. So SPACEAVOCAT, we are a firm dedicated to space activities. We are providing legal services and regulatory support. We are based in France, but we serve clients worldwide, and happy to further discuss. We have a booth right here, E18, so feel free for the 2 days to drop by, no problem. And now this is time for you question. So one here. All right.
Thanks for your presentation. And we are developing a laser communication device for the satellite. And then sometimes if my receiver has been damaged by some other like a device from very strong laser power, then for me, I have to convince about it was not our fault, but it was done by others. And do you have some kind of third party to do investigating for that kinds of happening in the SATCOM or LEO?
Do you have any idea of the mechanism that you could put in a contract?
Or mechanism or some kind of like even you or to do that for the like a clients and something like that.
That's a good question, because as we said earlier in the presentation, in orbit services, you're not there. So you cannot go on the factory and say, oh, this problem is coming from here and there. What we saw in the field, in the practice, is there is basically two approaches on this. Some clients, they like to implement as far as they can do, because that's something quite pricey, and that's also something you have to monitor from the Earth. So that's an extra payload, basically. So they have some sensors that are able to at least detect if there is any impact from little debris. So that's something they are able to do. You also have companies that are right now performing SSA, space situational awareness. What are they doing basically? They are taking a picture of the sky, and they are able to determine if you're going to have debris that may potentially hit your satellite. So long story short, if they have a picture of the sky at time T and your satellite is there and has been impacted, you can have a proof. You may have a piece of evidence that you could provide to your clients, especially if you have a loss of performance. You can say, hey, it's not my fault. Look at the sky at this time. There was a big debris, and the debris impacted my satellite. So that's why I had a disruption of service. So you have a lot of technical solutions, but I agree with you. Technical solutions are super important, but you have to take care of it in the contract. That's why we always say in this type of contract that the liability is very limited, and if there is an external problem, then that we can also list that affects the performance of the service, then we're not liable of this, or at least you can exclude part of the liability. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Strong presentation. So France is sort of a world leader in space law, I would say. What advantages are there to that versus countries that are a little more squeamish about setting up these kinds of hard regulations?
So I didn't hear you well with the mic. Sorry. So what you were saying, that how having a strong French law space law is an advantage?
Sure. Yeah. What is the advantage to regulation? What is the disadvantage? What would you say to countries that are very squeamish about establishing strong laws in space?
That's a great question. Thank you. First, if you want to have a space industry globally, I mean, as a country, if you don't have any space law, you are basically sending the signal to investors that they are in the wild. So at first it can be appealing. Problem is, if you want to have insurance, if you want to have partners, they're going to be a little bit reluctant to invest with you because they're going to be, okay, but I don't know if it's illegal. I don't know if it's legal. I don't know if that's covered by any national policy or whatever. So maybe I will go to another state that is a bit more advanced on this. So not having national statutes, it's quite tricky. On the other side, and I agree with you on this, because I can feel your question on this. If the regulation is too much, well, investors, they're going to do forum shopping. They're going to say, hey, okay, you want to regulate very strongly in orbit services, for instance. You want to regulate constellation super hard. We already invest billions in this, so we don't want to have an extra million or dozens of millions of euros to invest because we need to modulate the architecture of the system in order to accommodate with the regulation. So as you mentioned on your question, the idea is to have a balance. You cannot be ignorant about what's going on in the space industry. You cannot ignore the new trends, and you have to grasp on it as a space power, as a space agency. But you have to find the mix. And for me, the ideal way to find the correct balance is to basically contact the stakeholders, is to consult. A lot of like the CNES in France, but it's the same for the British Space Agency, the same for the US indeed. They are releasing regularly consultation for the space stakeholder. What do you guys think about this? What do you think about that? How should we regulate this? I think that's the right approach. You need to have, as I was mentioning on the presentation, you need to have a bottom-up approach. If you are doing something top-down, that's going to crash because you're going to either be too loose or you're going to be, and most of the time that's the way, you're going to be too hard. And investors are going to say, I'm not going to take this type of risk. So I'm going to just, change country. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, if there is an incident, who is responsible? Is it like written by the government, as you say, but is it like the launcher? Is it the satellite manufacturer, the operator that receive like for Earth observation mission, the services for the government? Is it why you're saying that we have to write it down on the contract before reading the regulatory or the laws from the country? Like if the payload is giving like Earth observation services for France, but the satellite manufacturer is like an Italian industrial, but it was launched in USA. Like who is responsible?
All right. Well, welcome to my world. Trying to find a good way. So thanks for the question. There's two parts in your question because you have basically what's happened on the ground on Earth to launch primarily the mission, and then you have the in-orbit side of the mission. I agree with you. If we are talking about the contract between the launcher on the ground going to a specific orbit to start delivering the in-orbit services, you're going to be on a very traditional scheme. You're going to have the LSA, Launch Service Agreement, kicking in. If you are so I understand in your idea, if you are launching, let's say in the US, but if you are a French operator, the French law will apply because you are a French operator. But you're also going to have to comply vis-a-vis your launcher with the American regulation, but most of it is going to be taken care of by the launcher. So that's a quite typical, use case. If you go into in-orbit services, everything related to launch regulation for the space activities is going to disappear because you're going to be after that. That's what they call LEOP, for instance, or everything that is after the launch per se in the contract. You have in-orbit operation coming up. Everything is basically governed by the contract. So if it's not operation as usual, like the traditional regime is like, let's say you talk about the French operator. The French has its satellite. Now the French is using its own ground station or it's renting it. That's a usual case. Problem is if you are starting to do other operation with other counterparts, you don't have any space law applicable. Treaties are very far away from what you are doing. So everything that you said, and as you mentioned, the liability that you are taking must be limited and regulated by the contract. Otherwise, that's a never-ending process. Of course, and as Sir mentioned earlier, you're also taking a risk. Like for instance, if there is a debris percuting and canceling the mission, that can happen. But even if you are, especially if you are trying to attract investors to fund your mission, it's very good for you to have everything in the contract. Looks like a train station. Any other question? I think the timing is perfect. I can see that the guys back there happy. So thank you again so much, guys, for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and see you soon. Take care.